So without further ado, we're very lucky to have you today for our speaker, and I hope you guys will enjoy.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for being here, and we're gonna be, as Vivini said, we're going to be going through some of these concepts around decision making, and I'm going to frame it within the structure and frameworks that are presented in the Bhagavad Gita, which probably most of you have heard of. If not, you'll get a little bit familiar with it from the course of today, but touching upon a couple of key concepts. So one's around free will, and the relationship of free will in the context of what we sometimes like the kind of deterministic approach and concept versus free will and how they're compatible, but also bringing into play some concepts from the Gita. One is around karma. You've heard of karma. How does that fit in with the whole destiny, free will thing? And a concept called the gunas. And these are what are sometimes termed or translated as the modes of material nature. But they have a really key role in all of this. So let's get started. Any of you seen this film? You're probably too young. But there was a film, so called The Minority Report, which essentially was based on this idea that you could predict who is going to commit a crime. And so if we believe in a deterministic flow of the universe, then if you have an infinite amount of information that's possible in feeding into the determination, then you can predict who's going to commit a crime. So these guys would determine who was going to commit a crime and arrest them before they committed it. Very helpful, right? So like this idea of free will and determinism has obviously been a topic of debate for millennia, right? So like how does that work? And so we're going to talk about this from the Gita's perspective. So in terms of chance, so just putting some kind of key concepts out there. In terms of chance, we often talk about randomness, chance, and we talk about it quite loosely. Something happened by chance. And one of the things that comes from this idea of the Vedic tradition is that chance is not a scientific concept. Because as soon as you say something happened by chance, that basically shuts down the scientific inquiry. Because if I say something happened by chance, then you can't investigate it further. It's chance, right? So as opposed to, I don't know what caused it, and therefore let me see why it happened. So sometimes we do this with the kids. You flip a coin, and the chance is 50-50, right? You repeat it over a number of times, and the chance is 50-50. But we know that if you were to isolate that experiment completely, you were to control all the factors within that action of flipping a coin, the force, the everything from the kind of air and all the rest of it, that no longer becomes chance. You can predict what's going to happen, right? If you had a robot doing it and you had all the inputs that you required, would it be chance? Clearly not. But because we don't have enough information feeding into the actual process, we call it chance, because that's all we can call it, because we don't know what exists beyond. But understand, that's not a scientific term. That's not a scientific approach, because it stops the scientific inquiry of what actually is behind that. Okay, so and then the question is, if we live in a deterministic world, if that's true, if there is nothing beyond matter, and matter is determined by the laws of nature that we understand in the scientific process, and if therefore that leads to a deterministic world because there's nothing outside of the forces that we understand through physics, then what happens to morality and justice, right? Where does free will reside? So how do you hold somebody to account in a deterministic world, right? And what happens to that? So again, a lot of this is lots of papers and philosophy and debates about this stuff. And we're going to talk about the Gita's perspective. And then this idea that if free will exists, where does it reside? So where exactly does it reside? And the Gita points to a spiritual perspective on this question. So what does it say in the Gita? So this idea that, selfish genes, right? Like, so that became a famous term. So like this idea that genes will push in one direction, and it's the higher self that needs to prevail. And that's where this point comes about free will. How do you exert free will? And what is it that's exerting free will? And then there's these three components of a universal system. So the Gita sets out the 5 main topics of the Gita. 3 of them describe the universe as we find ourselves in. What is the system? If we think of the universe as a system, what is the system within which we find ourselves? And it talks about these 3 factors. And these are mechanistic factors. These are non-spiritual factors. So time, karma, and the gunas. And we'll go through some of these things. But I remember when I first read the Gita and it was talking about time, and I was thinking, what's that got to do with a book on spirituality? But we'll go through exactly how time is such an essential requirement to make sense of karma and the gunas. And then the 2 components of free will and ultimate reality, which makes up your 5 topics. One is the self, the spiritual self, and the other is God. And so the idea is, within this system of these 3 factors, plus the 2 factors which bring in the components of free will, because absent the self and God, free will and ultimate reality kind of disappear, because you're left with a mechanistic set of things. And as long as you're left with a mechanistic set of things, you can't be talking about higher levels of things, such as free will. Okay, so let's talk about free wills, and we're going to talk about degrees of freedom. Okay, so this is just to introduce the point around karma and how it actually works. Come on in, guys, grab a seat wherever you can. Okay. We'll just wait a second whilst we can. Okay, so degrees of freedom. So at a certain point in time, and I'm sorry if this is too basic. I'm just introducing just to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into karma. So at a certain point in time, somebody has a decision, and their decision at that point in time, at a certain point in time, let's say that we take it from the point of perspective that you've got a wide degree of freedom. So at this point, this person on the bike has a bunch of different decisions that they can make, right? And it's a wide range of decisions that they can make, and they're going to make a decision. Now, once they've made that decision, the degree narrows, right? So the person decides they're going to steal the phone. Once that decision's made, you no longer have the option, right, of do I steal it or not. Now you have to face the consequences of stealing it, and now you have a choice as to what you do now that you've made the decision, right? So you have a decision about, now it's not do I steal it or not, now it's do I plead innocent or guilty. Okay, and then once I've pleaded innocent or guilty, if I'm going to jail, now I have a decision: do I try and run or do I try and serve out my sentence? Right. So you have different, like, narrowing degrees of freedom. Right. That's clear. Everyone's clear on that, and that's true for everything. And it's an important concept because sometimes questions arise about how karma works, and this is an important thing to bear in mind. This is not related necessarily to karma. It's a decision you make. It's something that's relevant anytime in whatever decisions you're making. So systems dynamics, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but a guy called Peter Seng who really brought this kind of aspect of, I guess it's used a lot in engineering and business planning, but about how to model very complex systems. So typically speaking, when you're looking at human systems or systems to do with the natural environment or other things, you have very complex systems which you can't plot in a standard way. So he developed this, it was decades ago, but he developed an approach to systems dynamics which brought into play these types of things. So like complex flows, time delays, causal loops, feedback loops, etc., as to how they affect, because the default can sometimes be, I'm an actor, I'm doing something, and then there's a very linear approach to what the reaction to that might be. But actually, there's a whole load of actors that I'm not necessarily aware of, nor am I aware of the effects of things like feedback loops and time. So he tried to plot this. So we're not getting into the details. I'll give you a sense of it. But the issue here is about the impact of time and space. Okay, so if I do an action, okay, I clap, you see me clap, and you hear the noise, and therefore it's very easy for you to connect the act and the effect because they're co-located in time and space. It's instant, right? The sound is, now if I did this and the sound came from over there, that would confuse you a little bit. And if I did this and the sound came in 10 seconds from over there, that would really confuse you, right? So you've got a separation of time and space, and every time you have an action and then you have a reaction that is distanced by time and space, the ability for us to connect cause and effect becomes very difficult. Like, we become very confused by that because we're not set up to connect cause and effect distance in time and space, right? We're good at doing it when it's instant. Now, as you can imagine, this has massive repercussions because most of the stuff that we does not have an instant reaction in time and space. Like, loads of stuff. And the things that we tend to focus on to our detriment are the things that are co-located, because those are the things that, in our simplicity, those are the things that we're built to deal with easily, or recognize at least. So here are a couple of examples. So echoes, right? That's why kids find echoes so amusing, because it's distanced. Like, oh, how did that happen, right? Same thing with getting paid. I'm working now, but I'm getting paid at the end of the month. It's like, well, that's just the way it works. And then when you're throwing a bird, like, I can't remember which author brought this example up, but it's a really good example. So if you're throwing a tennis ball to somebody, again, like flipping the coin example, you can determine a load of stuff in that and have a pretty good idea, and that's why we can throw tennis balls and catch them. But if you throw a bird, the bird's alive, you have another actor. Like, it's not going to follow the trajectory that you predicted, as you can predict with it, because you've got a different free will kicking in. So, when we're dealing in the material world, generally speaking, what are we talking about? Like, we're not generally dealing only with inanimate objects. So and the Gita provides a really powerful lens through which we can understand how to engage with a system that's not just inanimate. Okay, so I told you I was going to give you a very brief intro into systems dynamics, and this is one of my favorite examples. So this is the old days, way before you guys were born probably, but basically when you had these old hot water systems which would run showers, right? So you would have a system where you'd have one boiler, and it would have the T gap there represents time. So you've got a desired temperature, this is the temperature I want it at, okay? You've got the tap setting, and you've got the water temperature in actuality. And then you've got a time gap between I want it at a certain temperature, but there's a time gap between what I want and where it actually, time setting and where it gets to, right? So as soon as you have a time delay, so there's an issue about I'm adjusting the temperature and it takes time for the water to get to the temperature I want it at, right? So that's one delay. Now when I'm doing this, this is what happens. So over time, there's fluctuation in the beginning because I'm overcompensating for what I want, and then I'm undercompensating because there's a time delay between it. So, I think it's too hot, so I turn it cold, so I turn it, and then because there's a delay, I turn it more, and then it gets too cold, right? But then I figure it out, and it gets to the point where I want to get to, right? Okay, now, but here's a system where you've got two people. Now, two people are adjusting their own temperatures, and one temperature is being affected by what the other person is doing, right? Because there's two showers and they're supplied by the same system. Now, in this system, what happens is like it goes on. It goes on and on and on. Because, like, you're dealing with something else. You're not just dealing with a tap now. You're dealing with somebody else's consciousness. And dealing with that is a tough thing. Okay, so as Lorenz said, when the present determines the future, but the approximate present doesn't approximately determine the future, right? I mean, this is a really powerful statement in terms of this is why kind of the beginnings of chaos theory. This idea that in a deterministic idea, you're doing whatever you think you're doing and you're getting it a straight line, a straight response. but a small change, you can't approximate that in the future because the divergence is so wide that you can't predict that divergence. It's not like the divergence is the same as the divergence at the point in time. It splays out. So, so now to the Gita. So Arjun's asking this question of Gita. So the Gita is set on a battlefield. Arjun is our hero here, and he's speaking to his charioteer, who's also his mentor, and in the tradition, God, Krishna. And he's asking him questions because he's in a dilemma. And his dilemma is, do I fight or not? But that's another session. But here he asks Krishna the question, by what is one impelled to act even unwillingly as if engaged by force? So this idea that I want to do something, but I feel like I'm forced to do something else. Because Krishna's teaching about yoga. The Gita is essentially the book on yoga. And he's teaching him about mind control and things like that. And Arjun's saying, look, the mind is more difficult, as he says, to control than the wind. Like, good luck with that one. And then he says, this idea that we're being, it feels like I want to do something, but it feels like I'm being pushed or forced in another direction. And this is the nature of whether it's habits or conditioning or whatever we kind of want to term it as. So when we talk about free will, what are we talking about? Like what, because we've talked about degrees of freedom, and we're going to talk a bit about free will here. Is this person, this little girl here, is she expressing free will? Is she exercising, rather, free will?
No.
Sorry?
No.
No? Anyone else? Does she have a choice to lift this rock?
To a certain extent.
Some. Okay. Anyone else? None at all, some.
We don't know what the context is.
Don't know what the context is. Okay. So, what about here? So like somebody smokes, right? On the stupid packet, it says, smoking kills. And on the other side of the packet, it says, what is it? Highly addictive, don't stop. Okay, so now hey, have you seen a product that says, this is going to kill you, please buy it? Have you seen a product like that? So this is interesting marketing, no? So, I mean, obviously it's not marketing, it's a requirement, but the point is that the person who's buying the cigarette, who's smoking the cigarette, do they have a choice?
No,
Not if they're addicted. Okay, so maybe yes and then no. Something like that? And what about this? It's a big issue right now, not just for kids. Choice, freedom, expression, free will.
You don't have a choice, you cannot be held responsible or accountable.
Okay, so if you don't have a choice, you can't be held accountable. Okay, do you feel that this person's expressing free will? Exercising free will?
Yeah.
Yeah.
which again is the same as a cigarette example. We don't know.
Addiction. Okay, similar. Different things are affecting our free will, isn't it? Like, so for example, it may be physical threat that's imposing on our free will. Clearly, from a certain perspective, you could say, well, she could drop the rock if she wanted to. Right? But then what were the consequences that come from that? That's the issue. And then, you know, how do habits, how does social conditioning, how do these things affect our free will? So free will is not a black and white binary thing, right? We see different things, external and internal, impacting our free will, our ability to express free will. Does that make sense? Okay. So like there's this idea which is like we struggle to see the consequences, the long-term consequences of our actions. You know, we're doing something, but we don't know where that's ending up. And so like this idea of how does the Gita help us see through that perspective? And this is where this notion of the gunas comes. So the gunas are translated, as I said, as the modes of material nature, and they're essentially three categories. They sound like it sounds simplistic, but it gets really complex. So I'm gonna give you a really high level view on what the three gunas are, and then you'll get the sense of it. Okay. So here, this is the mode of ignorance. Okay. So this is it will go away, I don't care, everyone else is doing it, not my problem, and other self-destructive behaviors. This is to give you a flavor of what the mode of ignorance feels and looks like according to the Gita. Okay? So just try and hold these three concepts in your mind and you'll get a sense of it, and we'll give you some more kind of information. Is this clear? Do you get a sense of what this feels like? What type of consciousness this would be in? Ever felt like this? So the Gita is like telling us that these three things apply to all of us, and we're fluctuating between them. All right. Here's passion. Yeah. You see this guy on the bottom right? That's the main thing here. I must have it. I don't care what it takes. I want it now. Get out of my way. Greed, addiction, risk, but also creativity and intense activity. This kind of like real intensity sits behind passion. Recognize this? Yeah? Some of it? Okay. And here we go to goodness. So goodness is because it's the right thing to do. I've thought about this carefully. This is the best long-term outcome. We can all win. Considered and considerate. Know what that feels like? Less nods. Okay, so, but you get a sense of the three? Okay, now these are hierarchical according to the Gita. Hierarchical in the sense of aspirational in terms of our level of consciousness. You know, we all see these fluctuations in our lives, right? Year to year, month to month, day to day, moment to moment. We see fluctuations in our consciousness, our state of consciousness. So here we go. Mode of ignorance. So lazy, it's the easy choice. Okay, this is about procrastination, sense of resignation, carelessness. I don't care. Passion, this is the alluring choice. The shiny one. Okay, this is about greed and extremes, and it's short term. That's an important aspect here. It's about the short term goal here. And this is goodness. So this is the tough one. This is the tough choice. This is the one that's based on knowledge about long-term implications versus short-term, and it's about a lasting sense of fulfillment. Okay, and these, what the Gita tells us, this is where free will and how free will can be expressed. Because did you see, like when we were looking at I was asking you these questions about the pictures, about whether that person is expressing free will. And we were saying about how there are these external and internal factors imposing upon that free will. So what the Gita is telling us is, if you're hanging around at the bottom end of the spectrum, you're not able to express free will. Because there's so much conditioning, there's so much habitual kind of pressure forcing a certain type of behavior that you're not able to express your free will. And as you rise up the modes, Krishna tells Arjuna, as you rise up the modes, you come closer and closer to your natural state. And in that natural state is where free will is truly expressed. Because you've moved beyond just your conditioning, just the forces that are imposed upon you. By moving through that, you get to a state where you can express free will and actually then do what it is that you wish to do. Not just from a conditioned perspective, but from a deep, authentic, spiritual perspective. This is who I am, and then you can go from there. Okay? Do you get a sense of what the gunas are saying? Okay, all right, good. So let's talk a bit about, this is, somebody told me by looking at the number plates, this is Thailand, I don't know, but it could be a lot of countries I visited. Is this person expressing free will? Yeah? It's a good thing, right? Free will, free country.
Free will is a good thing, but what he's doing is not.
Why is that?
He's going the wrong way.
No, clearly. But why is it not a good thing?
He could have sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
An accident.
Okay.
He's endangering himself and others.
Okay. All right, so look, the question about whether this is free will or not, look, I have my free will. The question is, how is my free will imposing on your free will? Right? And the other thing is here, that it's clear that to enable free will to exist, you have to restrict free will. You have to restrict, you have to have certain rules and order, we call it the law. You have to have certain rules which allow free will to maximize. Because if you remove that, obviously you've got anarchy. You've got anyone can do whatever they want, and there's no legal structure, and what that does, it imposes on everybody else's free will, which reduces the overall free will that exists within a system or a society, however you want to term it. So to maximize the free will within a free society or in that system, you have to have choicefully selected which elements of free will are we going to restrict to enable everybody to have the maximum free will possible within that constraint. Does that make sense? Because if you don't have a rule that says everybody drive on the left-hand side or the right, whatever it is, if you don't have that rule and everyone's doing whatever they want, do you think that people are going to be increasing or reducing their free will? It's going to drop. Because guess what? Now you can't even drive on the road anymore. Okay, so the point here is that there are certain rules, even on something like a spiritual path, which help us structure that path in a way that enables our free will, even though from a superficial perspective, it may be like, why are you reducing my free will? Right? So, like for me, a personally kind of important one here is something like a vegetarian diet. So the idea is, well, why are you imposing a vegetarian diet that's going against free will? Yeah, okay, it's going against free will from that limited perspective. But what about, one, the free will of the animal, and the other is the overall impact of that diet enabling free will in the longer term for the society as a whole. So that's one example, but there are, like the point is that there is rationale for why free will moves in a certain direction and why we require certain restrictions, and that's the challenge. How can you minimize the restriction to maximize the free will, right? Because there's a really easy way to maximize the restriction, and then you have a problem. Okay, so I'm going to go through one example and then we're going to rush to the next because I think you've got it anyway. So I'm just going to go through a state of mind in the three modes. All right, so in ignorance, lacking goals or desire to achieve, disinterested in knowledge and growth, life feeling out of balance, confused, helpless, etc. Does this sound familiar to what we've already talked about? You've got it? Yeah? It's not? Okay. Passion, highly motivated to succeed, anxious, because they're constantly conscious of the result. And then desires and emotions are hard to control because it's so intense. And then goodness, peaceful, calm, objective, sense of control, instinctively know. Right, okay. So this is state of mind. And then the Gita goes through a whole list of things. I can't remember exactly. I think it's 27 areas where the categorization happens according to the modes, to give us a sense of this is what it looks like, this is what the modes looks like in this context. Now you can get a sense, I think, one of the things that really attracts me to this framework of the modes is that it's so universal. On the basic kind of approach, it looks like overly simplistic and even naive. But the way I like to kind of think about it is, we have three primary colors. Now, if you were to explain to somebody our color system and you say, these are the three primary colors, that also looks pretty naive and simplistic. But we know that the combination of those three things is what turns it into something that's not only universal in the sense that it's applied everywhere, but infinitely varied. And that's the same thing with the modes. So Krishna's explaining that these three modes, they interact in a way which enables them to be applied in any given circumstance or application or scenario or mindset or action. And by analyzing a decision or an action or something before you according to the modes, gives you immense empowerment into seeing through what the long-term impact is going to be. And do you remember when we were talking about it previously about the shower example, about how it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in a situation when you've got different actors? Well, this is a way that cuts through that. This is a way that enables you to get through what that outcome is likely to be. So I'm not going to go through this, but this is about personal choices, about how these can be analyzed according to the modes. And you get a sense of, And once you go through this a few times in a few different scenarios, it becomes very intuitive. And I think just in the few minutes that we've covered it, you've probably already got a sense of it. And it wouldn't take much for you to delve into this further to be able to apply it in any context. And you can, think about it. Some people think about it like a traffic light system. So like, we had the red, amber, green kind of system. So you can think about it like that. If you're in red and that's ignorance, then that means kind of relax, take a step back, think about what you're about to do. And then green is goodness. Is this kind of resonating? Does it make sense? Is the structure making sense? Okay. All right. I'm going to pause sooner rather than later. So you've got communications in the modes. We've got careers in the modes. And I've got a summary here, which I'm going to go through. So we've talked about this. It's simple and it's complex. The one part of the beauty of the modes is that it's very, very easy. It's very simple to get. You can get it in 5 minutes. But it's infinitely complex and varied. It's got universal application, we talked about that. And it allows you to take control of the present and predict the future. This is like, for me, it's such a... It was very interesting when I read the Gita first time, and I was thinking, why is Krishna spending so much time talking about the modes, or the gunas, which is essentially a materialistic, it's a material construct. And it wasn't until later when I fully understood the depth of the gunas and how powerful a construct they are. I mean, I've done the whole MBA consultancy thing, and I've not seen any framework anywhere which comes close to how insightful and powerful the gunas are in actionable insight into decision making. It's absolutely incredible, and I'm going to go through a couple of things for you, like next steps. But the idea is that taking control of the present is about how do you work your way through the modes. So, we were talking about how we fluctuate in our experience, and how do I move up the modes? Because we all get a sense, right? We want to get out of ignorance. It's not a nice place to be, even though while we're here, we're kind of swallowing in the kind of, it is the lazy choice, right? So it's like there's a certain happiness in laziness also, which we get, but we know that that's not the place for us to be. We want to move to passion. How do we move towards passion? And then on to goodness, because we also know that passion in its nature is fluctuating. So you have peaks and you have troughs, and you go through this so that nature of passion, whilst it's very alluring, we aspire for something that's like, why can't this stay? Like, why, you hit a high point and you're like, why can't it be like this? Well, and then the next moment something happens. So the idea is that by changing certain behaviors and habits and kind of ways of looking at something, we can gradually move up the modes to a place where we're more consistently in higher levels of consciousness. And as I said, one of the key purposes of rising up the modes and getting to high levels of consciousness is that's where free will can truly be expressed. That's when you can truly express your free will in terms of your state of being. So it's hard work. In the beginning, it can feel like that, but it gets easier with practice. So once you get more used to moving out of ignorance into passion, that's an easier thing. That's why some people, like, just at a very basic level, at a kind of basic level of ignorance, which is sometimes affected by things like depression, and how to get there, because goodness feels like too far a jump for that person who's in ignorance and who's feeling kind of really low and depressed. But getting to passion is actually possible for them. So that intense activity, whether it's going to the gym or something simple like that, can get them out of ignorance. So it's not the end point. Passion may not be the end point, but it's a helpful stepping stone to getting to goodness. And even goodness itself is not the end point, because from there you can express free will. So from there you can move to spirituality. Do you see? Like, that's the progression, to be able to move us to a place where we can actually truly express free will in the endeavor towards spiritual life. And you start with small steps. As with all great things, these things can happen with small things. You can make small tweaks to life to be able to open the door to this path. Okay, so we talked, a quick summary. So we talked about these three things as representing the system. We talked about the self and God added to that as the 5 topics of the Gita, which make up the whole system that we experience. And how we talked about without these, without the three above and the self and God, the Gita's proposition here is that the human experience doesn't make sense. So if you don't have karma, gunas and time, the human experience doesn't make sense. And if you don't have the self, you don't have free will. And therefore the idea that this is kind of a deductive approach also in terms of a rational approach to what is it that we experience and how can that be explained. So we talked about that. We talked about reconciling free will and determinism, and how if we ignore the system and other actors, we get a result that's very different to what we expect. And that's part of our problem. That's why systems dynamics was created in the first place, because businesses, corporates, governments, etc. were making decisions and they were getting a result that was completely different to what they were expecting. And it was because they weren't taking into account the system scenario. And that's the same thing with human beings. We try and do a bunch of stuff, and most of the time, we're getting results we're not expecting. And the reason is because we're ignoring a whole bunch of stuff. We think we're the only people acting in a scenario, but we ignore a whole bunch of other stuff, including karma, gunas, time. And that's what the Gita is trying to get us inside. And the Gita, therefore, is a handbook. So some people take the Gita, and it's historically seen and is legitimately a religious book in the sense that it's an interaction between Krishna and Arjuna. But it's also to others who take it as essentially a guidebook, a handbook to life, to people who are looking at it from a philosophical premise and a rational premise as opposed to a religious premise. And the basis of how it introduces both material analogies and examples which are easily relatable, but also takes us through a framework which you don't really actually require prerequisite faith in God to experiment with. Like, to experiment with the gunas, the modes, doesn't require faith in God. It may lead to faith in God, but it's not its starting point. And therefore, from the basis of a book of philosophical inquiry, which is also like the basis of yoga, right? Like that's why people are so in the West, it's become such a popular thing because it doesn't have that prerequisite. It develops over time because it's an experiential process as opposed to a process that insists upon faith in the beginning. So I'm sorry I've rushed through this. It's a huge topic. I feel like I've rushed through it anyway. It's a huge topic, and within each of these areas, whether it's karma, the gunas, the self, God, etc., you could do like, you could spend hours and hours talking about how the Gita speaks about these things. But in very simple terms, I just wanted you to get inside what the framework of the gunas is and how it relates to free will and determinism. And then hopefully, you can follow up with sessions which go more into the Gita or give you a sense of what that might look like. So I think we've got some time for some questions, and you tell me when to stop. Penny.
Keep going.
Okay.
Depending on how many questions people have.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. All right. So we'll see how it goes, and then at the back.
Yeah. Hi. You mentioned something about consulting in relation to the gunas. I was just wondering how those are related.
Did you say consulting?
Yeah, you said something about that, right?
Uh-huh. Oh, I think I said, sorry, I don't know if this was the context. I think I said that I did consultancy, as in strategy management consultancy, and an MBA. And I've looked at a zillion different PowerPoints, but also frameworks and behavioral frameworks and management frameworks and decision-making frameworks. And how I feel that the gunas is such... it has no comparison in terms of its ability to diagnose and oneself diagnose and then propose kind of ways forward in terms of decision making. So it's that. Sorry if that wasn't clear, but yeah, okay, yeah.
In terms of free will, how do you transition between the modes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, sorry if I'm understanding your question. Are you saying if you don't have free will lower down, how do you transition? Or
So if you're at the ignorant stage, how do I get to the passion stage?
yeah, okay. So, like we said, there is free will at every level, but it's reduced free will, right? So the free will rises as you go up the modes. So in the lower modes, particularly in ignorance, because that free will is very reduced. So what we are generally, if I'm living in the mode of ignorance, what I'm generally doing is just going with the flow. I'm just going with the way, like, you know, whatever's happening is happening. I'm just going with it. I'm not exercising any free will. But that's the role of knowledge. The role of knowledge is that even if I'm in the mode of ignorance, if I hear something, if I, you know, experience something, see something, somehow I gain some knowledge, which I understand that if I can, that there is something higher than this that I can get to, and how do I get there? So the knowledge here is that above the mode of ignorance is the mode of passion. So for us then to understand, what does that passion look like? So on any stepwise process, we always want to know, what is the next step? And if I know what the next step looks like, I then know, what do I need to do to get from where I am now to that step, right? So that's the same thing with passion. So it's to understand, what does passion look like? What does it feel like? And what does that mean for me in my context? So let's take the example of activity, like intense activity. So that's different to what ignorance looks like, because that's very kind of non-active. And therefore introducing elements of passion for us to, and that's why in the beginning I said it is hard work, because, you know, to get from that point, it requires endeavor. But it gets easier over time. But that's the first step, because sometimes what happens is we try and go from ignorance to goodness, and that's a difficult jump. And because it's so difficult, most people just fall back to ignorance. But the problem with passion is, when you get to passion, people like to stay in passion because that's the fun one, right? Passion is like very based on like gratification. So that's the fun one. But the problem with passion, for those of us who lived in that space, know that it doesn't last. Like, it just doesn't last. And that's the real kind of pernicious effect of passion, is that it will, you can try and sustain it, and that's what a lot of the material world tries to do, is promote passion and stay in passion. But it's just not possible. And we see it in history, we see it over time, we see it even in our lives. It doesn't stay there. And therefore, from passion, you have to move to goodness, because if you don't, you're going to drop down to ignorance, because you can't stay at passion. That's the kind of nature of the way the modes works. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk and insight. One question on consumerism. So recently we've had this shift where, especially Western younger generations, are spending more money quickly. So what is your opinion on that, and how does it fit within this decision-making framework?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, interesting. And is that a stat which is true across different populations in terms, because to give an example, like I can imagine how that would be very true for migrant populations Gen 2 or Gen 3, whereas Gen 1 is like all about saving and establishing yourself, and then kind of like second generation is born into money and it's like, let's have a good time, because, you know, and then, you know, is it across the board?
I think from the research I've read,
Yeah.
it depends on cultural factors, where you're from, it depends on your parents' income. So I think you're probably right. But as a general sort of trend, where younger people, maybe students at Cambridge, are spending more money faster and not thinking about the long-term effects of that.
Yeah.
Do you think that has like some way of fitting in?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'd love to see what sits behind that in terms of the research. From the Gita perspective, I think that's quite predictable in terms of like the more society does become materialistic and driven towards like materialistic external things, as opposed to because the thing about passion is that it's the assumption in passion is I will be happy from external things. It's a very external endeavor focus, whereas with goodness is I'll be happy from internal, and therefore I don't have to be so reliant on the external. So pushing towards passion as society does, and now society is getting better and better at pushing it, because now everyone's got a advertising machine on your, you know, in the palm of your hand 12 hours a day. So like if you've got an ad, like before it was on the TV or on a billboard or whatever it was, right? Now it's very different. Now it's constant, and therefore I'm not surprised that the rate of consumerism is progressing because we're getting better at it.
Okay, in terms of as like a tip from our own lives,
Yeah.
how do we sort of tackle this and protect ourselves from
Yeah.
increasing advertising on social media, for example?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a bunch of practical things that we can all do. One, get off social media, but like, you know, if that's not possible. But I think that's why things like the mode of goodness, like the framework, is actually really powerful. Like when I started using it, I started to reflect. First, I started to reflect on big decisions, and then it becomes almost like a habit where you're actually, and then it becomes intuitive, right? So in the beginning, it's quite hard because it's like almost like you're framing it, right? You're doing the intellectual thing. But then it becomes intuitive, and then it becomes very natural. So I know like something like a food choice, right? So like such a simple thing that we do every day. Now, you know, when you look at the options in front of you in terms of food, what is in ignorance, what is born out of violence, out of, you know, what's old and kind of cheap and nonsense, what is really attractive because you're driven by the taste buds, and what is going to be good for you. So you know very clearly, right, in a very simple way. Now the difficult choice comes, right? And that's why the goodness is the tough choice. I know this is good for me, but I want this. And the only way that you can make, well, not the only way, but one of the easiest ways that you can help yourself make the choice that you want to make, because remember, and this is the thing, right? This is where free will comes in. I want to make this choice, but I feel like Arjun said, I'm forced to make this choice because my tongue is pushing me this way.
Do you also maybe think about like how societal norms are shaping that, and like maybe why like the power to say no is like decreasing and decreasing? That's also feeding into this mechanism.
Yeah, I would say possibly true. Like, you know, we're pushing further down the modes just in the way societal factors are there. But the Gita is 5,000 years old. Arjun's saying the same thing. You know, like he's saying, look, I feels like I'm forced to do something I don't want to do. And that's how we feel, right? I mean, that's how I feel anyway. Like when I see these choices in front of me, I feel like, okay, I know I should be doing that, but I really want to, but you know, I feel like I'm forced to press snooze when I know I should be getting up.
So basically a lack of willpower.
Yeah, and how do we develop willpower, right? So willpower is that expression of free will. So it's, you know, it can feel a bit chicken and egg. Okay, I need to get to mode of goodness to express free will, but I can't get to the mode of goodness because I have no free will, right? But so it can feel like that. But that's what I'm saying, that it's incremental steps. So we may not be able to, so let's say, for example, I have an issue about waking up early in the morning, but I don't have an issue about food. Whereas you might have an issue with food, but not waking up early, right? So like I know the things that I can more easily affect change in my life. Let me start with those. So let me start with those things. And what will happen is I will see the benefit. I will see the benefit, and that's what creates faith, right? I see that, oh, look, this is actually working. It works for me. Then I can start to tackle the harder stuff because I'm convinced now that the system works, the process works. Because if I don't have that initial, then to make the difficult decisions is tough. So at least let me start with the small stuff and then build from there.
So basically, in essence, like we should experiment first.
Yeah.
And after doing that, this will have spillover effects to our whole life, which will lead to faith.
Absolutely. That would be my suggestion. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Start with the small stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have wanted to know your opinion as well. If you go up from, for example, passion to goodness, and then from goodness to spiritual, as you go up, the identification of what is good and is so difficult. It's not as easy as not eating a good and healthy and bad, but it's there you have a very small change that it will affect your journey up. So, which source you think that is more suitable to know which is good, which is bad? Because as you go up, it becomes so intricate. I think it's like slight changes can have an effect as well on you. It's not something that you can see sometimes very quickly, like having a bad food. This you're gonna see in your lifetime, but sometimes certain things you would not experience the results out of them, especially when you go up and up.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really the distinction between one and the other certainly becomes
Yeah.
thinner,
Yeah.
and it becomes more difficult to distinguish. There's a couple of things I'd say in response. First of all, particularly as you said, well, one is in the mode of goodness itself, and then from goodness to spiritual. I think that's the journey you were speaking about. So, yeah, and you know what's really interesting is in the Gita is the 700 verses, which is sandwiched in a broader text called the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata is 100,000 verses, so it's the longest poem, etc., classical poem. And the Gita is sandwiched in there. And one of the real distinguishing factors of the Mahabharata, compared to another ancient text called the Ramayana, the Mahabharata is completely full of moral ambiguity. Like, you cannot figure out in any of these scenarios what's right and wrong, and it's quite confusing. You go to the Mahabharata, you're like, I mean, you know, most people approach a religious text for an answer, like, just tell me how to live my life, right and wrong, black and white. Mahabharata is a complete opposite. You read the Mahabharata, however many people read it have that many opinions. It's like, it's so complex in terms of, because it's trying to get across through that text that, look, life is not straightforward. It's not so easy to categorize, you know. So whilst we're talking about it in this sense, remember the kind of analogy of the three primary colors, right? So you've got a blend of this in real life, and even within ourselves, we feel it, right? We see it, like, in one moment I'm in goodness, and the next moment I'm in ignorance, and I'm thinking, what happened there? You know, like, I was having a good day, like, so we feel that and we experience it, but the journey is hopefully a trajectory which is going up. So whilst in the moment, and even in the wider moment and days and weeks or whatever, but over the longer term trajectory, we feel ourselves moving towards goodness and beyond. So I'd say that that's a completely recognized issue about the ambiguity that comes goodness and beyond. And the resolution to that, which the Mahabharata points to in the Gita, and the Gita points to itself, is that when you get to that stage of goodness and beyond, the idea that it requires connection with the divine. Because without that, just working in the material sphere will have its limit. But when the soul, or when the self, the spiritual self, comes in connection with the divine, then it reaches its full potential of being able to flourish in full free will and in love. But to get to that point, these are the stepping stones that are required to be able to, because, you know, otherwise what happens is, you know, we're talking about spirituality and we're talking about love and all of these nice things, but like the actualization of these things, these principles, they're so lofty principles. How does one actually live in that space? And therefore Krishna is saying these are the stepping stones. Like, you go from ignorance, you go to passion, go to goodness. From goodness you'll be able to express free will, then you'll start to be able to engage in real connection with the divine, and that will be the full actualization of the self. So it's true, it's not an easy response, but that ambiguity, complexity is fully recognized, and it requires a connection with something higher.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
it becomes kind of this is kind of a dangerous area as well. You need some kind of mentoring as well sometimes.
Oh yeah, sure.
Because a small mistake can really sway you away.
Yeah.
As you go.
Yeah, another excellent point. Yeah, it requires guidance. It does. And just to say, on that point around guidance, the Gita again is instructive, because the Gita points us to, like, the onus is on you. You cannot abdicate your responsibility for choosing the right guide. So when you choose the person who's going to guide you, that's on you. Like, you use whatever means, intelligence, rationale, whatever you want to use, whatever brings you to that conclusion, that's on you. And then once you've made that decision, that person can guide you. But you have to take ownership of that. But it's better you take ownership of that when you're slightly higher up the modes than if you're lower down. And that's why you get so much blind following in religion. Because the people in the mode of ignorance, they like kind of just fully kind of surrendering to something they have no idea about, No idea of that some crackpot is, talking about something. You get so much cases of like sex and abuse and all of these kinds of things and hypocrisy because there's people spouting religion who they will appeal to people who are in ignorance and who are happy to stay in ignorance because it's like, cheaters and the cheated. I want to be cheated because I want the easy way out, and somebody happens to be a good cheater, and I'm like, well, it works. So yeah, it's an important point, but better we do that in an informed situation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I am from a background of no religion, so this is interesting to hear about. But started looking into spirituality and meditation and like sort of experiential, like you mentioned, things that helped up the most. Why do you have so much emphasis on the faith and not the experiential side of things? Because I think in generations coming up, as well as mine, there's so many issues, not to mention, loads, but mental health being a really, really important one, which can be really difficult to work up there.
Yeah.
And I think experiential journeys can help with controlling that and looking into yourself and like consciousness and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, no, fantastic. But your question was, why did I have more emphasis?
Is there emphasis on actually the faith of writing and things rather than, is that what you were saying?
The faith of what?
the writing, and you said towards the end of your talk that it's emphasis on the faith and not the experiential.
No, so maybe I misspoke. What I meant was that your faith in the actual process builds with experience.
Right.
So I think we're saying the same thing actually, because I'm fully on that page. Like, I believe that, I personally feel that that kind of top-down didactic version of religion is like, has had its time. I think people want to see experience and the evidence of the tangible kind of effectiveness of something that somebody's telling me, rather than me being expected to follow something because I was born somewhere or I was told something, whatever. So yeah, I mean, and the Gita is all about that. I mean, the Gita doesn't even assume that somebody is a religious person. I mean, what's interesting, I mean, the very first chapter of the Gita, it is the first, isn't it? I know, somebody, first or the second. I think it's the first. But where Krishna is saying to Arjun, even if you don't believe that the soul exists, then X, Y, Z. I won't get into the X, Y, Z just because it's not relevant here. But what I'm saying is, in the context of the Gita, Krishna is making the assumption that somebody may not believe in the soul. Now, if you don't believe in the soul, you don't believe in God, right? Like, there's no spiritual. So there's an assumption in the Gita. That's not where Krishna ends up in terms of taking the conversation. But what I'm saying is that there isn't a presumption, there isn't a prerequisite faith required to experiment with the Gita. And that's, for me personally, I find that very attractive. I find it attractive that I can look at the Gita and I can see the examples and the experiment it's providing in there. And I can judge for myself as to whether or not it's working for me. And then I can decide whether to take it further or not. And that's the invitation of the Gita. And at the end of the Gita, after Krishna said everything to Arjun, you know what he says? He says, and this is unique, I think, for a religious book. He's saying to Arjun, so I've told you all this bunch of stuff. Think about it. I'm almost verbatim. Think about it for yourself and decide what you want to do. He's saying that. So like, Krishna is not saying, these are all the things you need to get on with. He's basically saying, these are all the things that are in front of you. These are all the options that are in front of you. This is where these options will lead to. You decide where you want to go. Make your choice. And that's the world that's how we feel, right? Like, we've got a bunch of choices in front of us. We need to figure out now, where is it that we want to go? Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
Sorry, I have some questions about the structure of the ignorance, passion, and...
Sure.
So, because of your analogy with color, right? I'm not sure right now, like...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, does it exist on a hierarchy, or does it exist...
No, sorry, the analogy is very limited. So yeah, the analogy is limited. It doesn't extend to hierarchy for the colors. The reason why the hierarchy exists for the modes is because of the ability to express free will.
So it's more like a free will is like a sort of sorry,
No,
I
go
prefer
ahead.
physical analogy, so something like a slider, is it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the idea. So that you want to
Ignorance is on one side and like
exactly.
passion somewhere in the middle, and
Yeah,
okay.
because we want to be able to express our true nature. That's where we're most happy. But to be able to express our true nature means we need to be out of a situation where everything is being forced upon us, either externally or internally through habits and conditioning.
I've actually a second part, which
Mhm.
is basically because this is with relation to decision making, is that right? So with respect to like each of the decisions, they can have like different amounts of like they will have like different amounts of like ignorance,
Yeah.
whether you're ignorant, passionate, or like looking towards goodness for each of the decisions, right?
Yeah.
And so that's more of basically that's more quantized, right? So each decision will have like a sort of different like amount of free will involved.
Yeah, just to make sure I understood the question. Are you saying that people in the different modes will have different degrees of freedom within that decision because they're in a different mode?
Yeah, but I'm also not sure whether basically would it be because of the decisions that you make then you consider yourself in a certain mode, or because you're in a certain mode then
Yeah, okay.
you're in a
Yeah,
certain
so chicken and
series of
egg.
decisions?
Yeah, so that was what we were speaking about. Yeah, so for sure. So your mode will influence the decision and your decision will influence the mode. That's true. And that's where most of us unfortunately get caught in a cycle. Because sometimes, I don't know, I've experienced it where I feel like I'm stuck somewhere. And you feel like, how do you get out of that situation? But so it's not denying the fact that there is a cause and effect loop going on here. But what it's saying is that if you're in the cause and effect loop and you know that something exists outside of this, but you know the right step to take immediately rather than 2 steps in advance, that will enable you to take that step rather than trying to jump here because you can't get to here because there's too much stuff going on here. So that's where the break in the cause and effect loop can happen, because we see something that we can tangibly do. Because not everything within our life is constrained as everything else. So like, I was giving the example about waking up and food.
Yeah.
So like different things will be of different kind of pressure points for us.
Different
So
valuations.
yeah, exactly. So if we work on the things that we can work on, that will permeate the rest of our being and help us move out of where we are stuck.
So you're kind of saying that although it's probably possible, but it's very unlikely for you to be like very like towards goodness in one aspect of your life and very towards like ignorance for another aspect.
Yeah, it's likely that we will have fluctuations. It's unlikely that we will be able to go from one state in entirety to another state. I mean, none of us are going to be entirely in one thing anyway. We're all going to be mixed colors, right? So like that's what it is. But in terms of the progress, that will happen incrementally. And then as it starts to permeate and it becomes part of your natural way of being, you'll start to do more and more things in that direction.
So it would be closer to like a black and white photo or something like that. So basically you try
Oh, right.
closer to that.
Huh.
Because it's not so much
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you could think of it like that.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe I should change it from 3 primary to black and white, yeah? And the grey.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else? Yeah? Right.
I have a question which is slightly tangential to the topic at hand, but it's more about your book.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's a long time ago. I don't know if I remember what's in it, so no detailed questions.
So, how does this idea of we have karma, time, and the gunas,
Yeah.
which form this system, and self and God, which form the complete picture? How does that play into decision making in a society that's driven by capitalism for us?
Yeah. You see, like, the reason why I framed it like that in terms of the Dharma of capitalism was about that there are different approaches to capitalism. Like different economists have given different approaches to capitalism and the, like free markets and how free they need to be and all that kind of stuff. And the acceptance of greed as either a positive or a negative factor, right? So different approaches will have different opinions on that. So the modes helps us look at that from a lens, through a lens which enables us to see that there is productivity that comes from passion. There's creativity, there's productivity, there's activity, and there is a benefit that comes from that. The problem is, if you don't know the toxicity that also comes with that, and you just let it go rampant, you have a real problem. Because that's going to drop you down into another situation which is not passion, because you can't stay in passion, it's going to drop you down into ignorance. So the idea is that material things, I mean, we all have material things, right? Like, so we all need material things to survive. The question is, in what context, and how do you contain that so it doesn't become toxic? And how do you elevate that so it can actually be used for the benefit of society and individuals, right? So like, and that's about moving it to goodness. So that's about being able to keep capitalism between the spectrum of passion to goodness rather than passion to ignorance. And that's what the book talks about. Like, how can we make decisions that enable us individually and as a society and as a economic society to be able to do that. And do that in a way which I don't believe is to the detriment of our economic development, but actually could be a more sustained approach. And it's about, developing those, developing, or rather, placing value on those things which will lead us there, than just be driven almost in a very blinkered way, which is not guided by anything else other than stay within the law and make as much money as you can. Because those are very basic things. But how do you elevate that? So that's kind of where the book is coming from in terms of, go on.
So in regards to, you mentioned nicely the idea of how greed can be looked at as a positive or negative thing, and is looked at differently by different economists. Would society be better if the markets were freer, or if there was more government intervention involved?
Yeah, look, I'm not an economist, and I don't think anybody is. I think a lot of people, in things like this where you've got very, very complex systems, we were talking about complex systems, right? So like the economy is a very complex system, and you obviously, as we've seen in the recent past, you have some people who have no idea what they're talking about and they get it wrong. And then you have some people who know a bit more and they get it a bit better, but there's nobody who knows exactly what's going on. Because you can't. We don't know the consciousness of each individual, right? So you can't, it's not like a mechanistic system that you can just predict out. But what you can do is, and that's where the modes is important, because we know if you follow a certain trajectory in the mode of passion, this is where it's going to take you. And that's the insight it gives us. Whereas if we push towards more, towards goodness, recognizing that economic development, the generation of wealth, is inherently a passionate activity. Generally speaking, not entirely, but generally speaking, that's the nature of it. But how do we contain it? Like, what are the things that it should be contained within? And what do we set out as the actual purpose of it? Because there are economists who promote that the only direction or goal of capitalism should be the increasing of shareholder wealth. That's the only thing. I mean, I worked for a consultancy where our entire approach was based on increasing shareholder value. There wasn't anything else. The entire approach to valuation of companies that we carried out, the entire raison d'etre of that purpose, of how we were presenting the purpose. And that's what made me really think about this, like, in the sense of, is that really the case? Do I really believe that? And I felt like I didn't actually. I think there is more to it than that. But yeah, it's a big, so I'm not going to answer your question as to whether or not I think more or less intervention, because I don't know. I'm not an economist, but I know, well, not I know, but I do think that the modes can give us insight into understanding which direction it will take us in. Yeah.
Closely linked with that question, in the talk you mentioned about how we need to minimize the constraint to maximize the free will. So I had two questions. One was, how do you determine those constraints?
Yeah.
And two, how do you implement them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough question. How do you? I think that's the real intelligence. That's the art which we need to practice and get good at. Is how, and it's a really good training ground. A really good training ground is kids. So like when you have kids, if you have kids in the future, if you have kids, you learn very quickly. Look, ultimately, as a parent, I'm a parent. I want my kids to be free. I want them to be happy, right? Like what parent doesn't? So, or some, but we'll leave them aside. But you want them to be happy. Now the question is, I want them to be disciplined. I want them to be respectful, but I want them to be free. So what are the minimum things I need to kind of impose upon my child in terms of forms of discipline, whatever, encouragement, punishment, in order for them to flourish as a human being? So it's a good training ground. Like, you kind of like get to grips with it. But that you scale that up for your personal situation and for a community, for a society. But I think the principle is this. The principle is that we need to be really smart, like really thoughtful. Actually, smart's the wrong word, but really thoughtful and learning from history about what are the minimum ways that we need the legal structure to operate, but with an aim to help people rise up the modes. What is our aim in society? Is our aim in society keep people safe and then let them do what they want within that structure? That's one approach. Now, if I'm a parent, I can create a playpen and say, do what you want. Or I can have a goal. That doesn't mean I need to be instructive or didactic in my expression of that goal, but I have a purpose in mind. My purpose in mind is I want the child to be educated. I want them to be thoughtful. I want them to be introspective. I want them to be compassionate and contribute to society. All of these things, right? Now that's a purpose. I have something. It's not like I'm going with a blank sheet, like I don't care what you become. I don't care what you become. I'll keep you safe. And is that the society we live in, where we'll create a legal structure, we'll create an economic structure, and within that, your values, your aspirations, we don't care. We're ambivalent. We're agnostic. Do what you want. Or is it that we want society to move to a place where people are expressing high degrees of free will and are more conscious in their existence, i.e., are more in a state of consciousness, and I think it's more the latter. I think that we have a role to help create a society that's beneficial for everyone, not just agnostic and dog eat dog. And
give knowledge to make sure that people are more aware of their decision making and make better decisions.
Yeah, knowledge, and it requires, and that's what our education system is about. Like we've taken a view in Avanti, in this trust that I'm CEO of, we've taken a view that we want to create individuals who can contribute to society, who can live in higher consciousness. We're not agnostic about that. There are some education systems, some trusts, who explicitly will state that we don't care about the moral outcome of the individual. All we care about is the have they got education qualification? If they've got that, beyond that, it's not our job. And that's not true for for Avanti. And I think as a society, I would argue that our role doesn't just stop at the absolute bare minimum. Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Is everyone capable of reaching this highest level of goodness or self-realization and stuff like that, or can some people just not reach out? If they choose not to, make all the choices.
Yeah. So at the end, you said if they choose not to. Did you mean that, or?
So you said the Gita tells people here's what you can do.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then they just exist on a different level.
Yeah, and that's the case. I mean, inherently, one of the core attributes of the self is free will. that we have a degree of free will that we can choose to express. And so therefore, everyone has the capacity to reach the higher levels of consciousness on an absolutely equal level. But we find ourselves constrained to different degrees based on past conditioning. And so therefore, it may be harder for one person to reach that than for somebody else, just because they've got different habits. They've made past choices, which, we were talking about degrees of freedom, right?
Yeah.
So like, if I'm further down that process, my degrees of freedom are less than somebody who's at the beginning stage of that decision-making tree. So if I'm earlier on, I've got a wider range of choice. But even at the point where I'm narrowed down and I have a reduced degrees of freedom, I still have some choice. And as I start to make those choices in a particular direction, it starts to widen again. So then that's up to me. If I don't want to do that, if I want to stay in a particular scenario and keep narrowing, that's a choice I'm left with.
So, in order to maximize people reaching that level,
Yeah.
would that mean like if there's like a child, you start early and like
Yeah.
make sure there's no like conditioning?
Yeah. I mean, 100%. I mean, that's why in the education system, the early years are so, and even like the Vedic system, in the Vedic, there's a really nice analogy that's given about how when a child is conceived within the womb of the mother, and for those 9 months. So it's said that the consciousness is like writing on wet concrete. I don't know what the Vedic term was, but the translation is like concrete, right? So it's wet. It's very easy. You can just write. And then as you grow, it becomes harder and harder. And then at a certain point, it becomes very hard. And that's why some of us, when we are heavily conditioned, for us to move out, it really feels like hard work. But the thing is that as you do it, that naturally as you practice the mode of goodness, as an example, as you practice it, that mode of goodness attracts goodness. And you can experience this. This is very real. Like, I'll give you an example. If you go for a walk in nature, that's a very kind of mode of goodness, typical kind of example where you're connected to nature, you're free from kind of like the constraints or pushes. It feels natural. When you do that, you get a taste for it, right? Like in the beginning, when you're, I won't talk about my kids, but if somebody is stuck at home and playing something on their TV or whatever, and you say, go for a walk in nature, it's like, don't want to go for a walk in nature. But so there's a resistance in the mode of ignorance, because it's like, I'm stuck here. It's like, I don't want to, there's no momentum. But as I grow through that, and as I go, then when I'm on that nature walk, I feel a taste for it. So then what happens is I want to go back, because I know, even when I'm back watching my TV next day, I'm feeling, it did feel good. I did like that experience. So that plants a seed. So it's conditioning, but conditioning the other way. Now it's positive conditioning. And then over time it builds.
So does that mean removing past conditioning and becoming like, does that mean changing yourself, or is it just like?
Past condition, so conditioning, the very word conditioning, is essentially an external imposition. So it's not changing yourself at a base spiritual level. It's changing the stuff that's on top of the self. It's like a habit, right? We've created this. That habit is not me. Like if I have a habit of smoking, that's not me. I wasn't born with that. And in the Eastern tradition and the Gita, many Eastern traditions, but certainly the Vedic tradition, there's the idea of reincarnation. There's the idea of past lives. So that conditioning also kind of moving across lives. Yeah? Okay. I think we're at the end. Bhavini, over to you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
That's a bit of a mission to get through everyone. Thank you so much for the talk. It was a really, really interesting talk, and I hope that all of you guys sort of took one thing at least from it, which you can apply.